Previously on Part 1. In 1992, Don Starkle and Victoria Jason clawed their way to Joe Haven after 2 brutal years of Arctic kayaking, hauling sleds across frozen tundra, dodging polar bears, surviving storms, and eating more seal meat than any southerner should. There were blizzards, frostbite, edema. Don antagonized a polar bear to get a better photo. They had to out-paddle one that was chasing them, and somehow they made it. But it did nearly kill them. Victoria's body was breaking down. Doctors said she was 1 day away from permanent heart damage, so she tapped out. Don was still obsessed with finishing the Northwest Passage, racing the ice and refusing to slow down. He left Victoria behind, and what followed was pure Arctic insanity, most of which Don brought on himself. After Don left, Victoria crashed hard. She slept 20 hours a day and could barely move, but the people at Joe Haven took care of her. She actually joined in on the Hamlet spring cleanup and wandered through town, hung out with people, and even caught the season's first tee-off at the local golf course, complete with snow traps and golfers in hip waders. Definitely a different golf course. Each day she pushed herself a little bit more. Her feet were still swollen, but being surrounded by people who lived and thrived in this place made her feel alive again. But she was heading home. As the plane lifted off, she looked down at the Arctic Ocean, and Don was still out there somewhere chasing his obsession, and she was heading home. On June 21st, Don set off alone for the 500 kilometers or 300 miles from Joe Haven to Cambridge Bay. The first major stop was Jenny Lind Island, about halfway. He was scared, he was lonely, but he was still pushing forward, even though he admitted he wasn't sure why. Victoria was now back home recovering, and she told the Winnipeg Free Press that Don's compulsion to make extra miles was getting to a dangerous level. And she wasn't wrong. On day 1, Don overdoes it instantly. By the end of the day, he needed help from locals just to set up his tent. And luckily, he was close enough to town that there were locals around. In the first week, the GPS saved him again and again, and even then he was making major navigational errors. Everything looks the same, so it's really difficult to tell you where you are. The snow, the ice, the frozen ocean, white shoreline, they were all blurring together. But he learned a lesson. He was now walking through the night, so the hikes were from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. And the temperatures were swinging wildly. It was 33 degrees Celsius or 92 Fahrenheit in the day in the direct sun, and then it would be freezing at night. His body was having a hard time regulating anything. He was soaked, shivering, and sunburned. It was pure misery. He would be sinking into the slush with every step, smashing through crusted snow. And then as he was walking, he heard a low, sucking, wet sound. He was turned around confused. Like, what the heck is that? And he saw this swirling in the ice behind him. It was a whirlpool. And what used to be a harmless seal-breathing hole is now a full-on whirlpool, draining rapidly, draining the meltwater on the ice. And he said that these holes could easily suck someone down, so I have to watch out for them. Great, thanks, Don. I'm adding that to my list of recurring nightmares after polar bears. 2 weeks in, the ice becomes a minefield of moguls. The sled slammed into his legs, flipped over, and pinned him underneath. He was wiping out hundreds of times. He actually wrote in his journal, "Only the most stubborn and stupid mind could keep me going. If I had known the problems I'd encounter, I would have never left Joe Haven." Finally, he reached Jenny Lind Island, and he was soaked, shattered, probably has trench foot, but he's still crawling forward. He'd been out for 13 days, dragged his sled 250 kilometers or 150 miles, face-planted through slush, dodged whirlpools, and somehow kept going. His next destination was Cambridge Bay, only a mere 138 kilometers or 86 miles away, practically next door in Arctic distances. He said, "For the first time in a long time, I feel things might have finally turned in my favor." Spoiler, they had not. As he fell asleep one night at camp, his tent collapsed on him, and he woke up in his wet sleeping bag, soaked and hypothermic. He had 2 options: stay and freeze to death, or walk until he warmed up. So he walked, and he stumbled into Parker Bay, 8 miles of breaking ice and open water. He actually started hallucinating and he thought he saw a castle on a ridge. Except this time it wasn't a hallucination, it was a real building. He was able to crawl inside and pitch his tent inside it to get double shelter, and was able to thaw out a little bit. By that time though, his hands were useless and his foot was sore. Everything he owned was soaking wet. He said, "Surviving when you expect to die does strange things to you. I was suddenly king, and for now, this was my land to rule." I don't know if he was losing his mind here or what. But he improved a little bit because he was there for a couple days, kind of thawed out, got his senses back, sort of. You can be the judge of that. Because the next thing that happened, he was ferrying some items to his kayak, which was a little ways away from the tent, and he spotted a muskox who bluff charged him. And Don did the most logical thing in Don's world. He stood his ground and threw rocks at it. But it actually worked because he didn't get killed by the muskox. The next day, there was a whole herd of muskox, including a calf. And most people would just kind of back away, avoid them. But Don, he charged towards them. This is the guy who chases caribou randomly for no reason. And when he charged at them, the herd, they formed these classic defense circles where they have the calves or young ones in the middle, and then the adults are on the outside with their horns out, ready to kill and maim and puncture anything that comes its way. Or gore. I guess gore them is a better term. Don picked up a 5-foot stick and walked right up to them. And they bluff charged him repeatedly. Don just stood there, waving his stick like he was somehow winning this face-off with these tanks with horns. And somehow they didn't run him over again. It was like sometimes nature's rules didn't apply to Don, or he had a horseshoe up his butt. But that was his evening entertainment, I suppose. On July 7th, with a still wet sleeping bag, Don made his final push to Cambridge Bay. Don finally got to Cambridge Bay and was able to have his first bath in 3 weeks. He peeled off layers of sunburn and dirt off his face, and he'd actually lost part of a tooth along the trail, and at Cambridge Bay he was able just to yank the rest of it out to make the pain stop. He wrote in his journal, "I just finished the toughest physical challenge of my life," and then in peak Don fashion he mailed his rifle home to save weight. And actually he's heading into grizzly territory now too, so he's got polar bears and grizzly bears to watch out for. Can you imagine a worse scenario? Or more of a nightmare? Now I'm going to have nightmares about both of them. Dang it. But there was one good thing that happened. Open water. He was finally able to ditch the sled. From here on out, it would just be him and the kayak and whatever the Arctic had to throw at him. He was ecstatic and said that I was kayaking again and free of my sled and flying in a lead that was fantastic. 20 to 60 feet wide. Because perfect Arctic conditions never last. And then that lead vanished completely. Don had to get out and walk again, but this time he was dragging his kayak, but without the help of a sled. And he was in his neoprene kayaking booties, trudging across slushy ice. And then he fell through 5 times, up to his armpits. This whole trip is my literal nightmare. Falling through water up to your armpits, sucking whirlpools and polar bears chasing you. Oh man. But he kept going. I don't know how he kept going. He took a 2-day break on McAlpin Island and another place where he was finally able to get warm and dry. He had about 25 days of food left, hopefully enough to get him to Coppermine, or Kugluktuk, as it's known as today. And that's when he realized he was missing the maps for the rest of the trip. But Don didn't panic. He still had his GPS, which he planned to use only when he got close to Tuk. Don was paddling near Turnagain Point and getting devoured by mosquitoes. They were so relentless, he described them like something out of a horror film. Even the caribou were running into the ocean to escape them. He said at night, thousands of them were tormenting me and I could hear them buzzing even inside the tent. Coming up was his next big hurdle, a 60-kilometer, a 36-mile open water crossing of Bathurst Inlet. And these are dangerous, these open water crossings, because one wave that far from land could capsize him and kill him. So he's a little bit nervous. Before he started across, Don meant to stop and check his GPS, but he couldn't because the waves were just too rough to land and check it out. So he launched straight into the open water without really knowing exactly where he was going. And the wind and waves were relentless. He was really far from shore, visibility was poor, and worst of all, his kayak was starting to leak. It was taking on water during the riskiest crossing. Either he's the luckiest man alive or karma just forgot about him because he actually made it across successfully. And he crossed the inlet just in time because then the bad weather grounded him again. Don spotted this cluster of abandoned shacks in the distance, and curious, he decided to go check them out. But a massive rock cliff stood in his way, and instead of going around or, not climbing at all while you're alone in remote Arctic land, he decided to climb it anyways. And while he was climbing up, he reached up and dislodged this huge rock that crashed down onto his foot, crushing 4 toes on his right foot. Oh, Don. He hobbled back to camp in agony, too afraid to take off his boot. And when he finally did, the damage was clear. His foot was swollen. His toes were already turning black and blue. He yelled at himself for being so careless, and it was one of the most agonizing nights of his life, he said. And the next morning, he had to cram his mangled foot back into his kayak booty. By some miracle or sheer stubborn willpower, he limped into Coppermine on August 1st. He said, "My crushed foot is now oozing strange liquids. Must see the nurse." The timing was crucial. Don wanted to leave again in a few days because every single day mattered in his race against freeze-up. X-rays confirmed 3 broken toes, dislocations, and chipped bones. They tried to set those toes as best that they could and cleaned him up, bandaged him, and gave him some antibiotics. And that injury did not stop him. He still planned to leave as soon as he could. A few broken toes and a little gangrene weren't going to stop him now. He had a huge stretch ahead of him, 1,200 kilometers or 750 miles without resupply. And his hard cutoff was September 15th, and that's when he told his sons that he would be back. And that's when the ocean would begin to freeze again. And with a broken foot, infected toes, no gun, and winter closing in, Don was going for it. He got to Cape Parry, which had once been part of the DEW Line, short for Distant Early Warning Line, which was a chain of Cold War radar stations built across the Arctic to detect incoming Soviet bombers. And most of them were decommissioned in the 80s, but the remains of the buildings are still there. And what did he find? He found a full-blown Arctic oasis. He actually stumbled upon a party shack for the workers. This was actually a camp where there were still people working at it, but he didn't know that. While Don was making himself at home in the party shack, they all showed up for the party and were surprised to see this beaten-down kayaker in their shack. So they welcomed him with open arms, and then the party began all night and into the morning. Don was letting loose and had a little bit too much rum and a whopping headache the next day. Could you imagine going out into those conditions again after being hungover? I would not want to leave. And he actually didn't want to leave either. He said it was really, really difficult. But he had to finish this trip he started. So off he went, right into the next round of chaos. On September 1st, paddling through freezing winds, soaked to the bone, and barely holding it together, Don spotted what he thought was another muskox lumbering along the coast. So he paddled over to get a closer look, of course. But surprise, it was a grizzly bear. And he shouted and waved and paddled like a maniac, and somehow the bear ran off. But that wasn't even the weirdest part of the day. Later that evening, he spotted more shadowy figures on the tundra. More bears? As he was camped for the night, he thought, oh man, I'm not leaving my campsite. He was too tired. So, like any completely rational human, he thought he would go confront the beast. He grabbed the weapons he had, which were a knife, a soggy bear banger, ski pole, and he marched off to the animal. Luckily, that beast just turned out to be a very chill muskox munching on the grass. And then Don paddled into one of the most surreal Arctic landscapes, the Smoking Hills. And this is where underground sulfur fires have been burning for centuries. Don said it was as if Van Gogh had gone crazy with a giant paintbrush. The cliffs were streaked in reds and yellows and blacks and grays. Smoke drifted across the landscape, and the ground was actually warm and hot in places, which is kind of wild. It was beautiful, but it was unnerving, and it was also pretty toxic to breathe in. And for once on the trip, Don actually slowed down and reflected and enjoyed that moment. And he was kind of humbled and even cautiously optimistic that he was going to finish this trip. But he did know deep down that the weather was turning and he needed to hurry. On September 6th, Don reached Nicholson Point, which was another one of those DEW Line outposts. And there was some staff there, and the kitchen staff gave him some food, but one worker pulled him aside and gave it to him straight. He said, "It's stupid to be paddling on the Arctic seas after September 1st. In fact, it's suicide." Don was a bit rattled by that, and he didn't get rattled a lot. September 9th approached, and all the cliffs that he had seen were gone. It was now sand and low tundra, and he thought it should be pretty easy, flat shoreline, calmer seas, but instead it became the site of one of his worst Arctic nightmares. 2 days earlier, where he was camped, a massive storm had ripped across the area like a freight train. At his camp, Don tried to prepare by building this sand wall fortress around his tent, but that wasn't enough. By morning, the wind collapsed the tent and pinned him underneath his tent, smothering his face. He was numb, he was freezing, and he felt trapped. His arms and legs were too cold to move, and for a moment, all he could do was lie there, wondering if the rising sea would take him with it. He hoped to be much closer to Tuck by now, but instead he was trapped on a flooded sandbar, barely surviving. 2 days later, Don awoke to snow covering everything. Hello, winter. The tent was shredded from the wind, his gear was soaked. I don't think it was ever dry, really. Parts of his camp was underwater, and he still had 160 kilometers or 100 miles to go. I mean, that was pretty close, but still, that's a long way in those conditions. So his best shot was a desperate push to McKinley Bay, where he hoped to find shelter at a long-abandoned oil site. He paddled for 10 hours, soaked and shivering, and then finally got to the bay. He found a trailer and was able to get into it. It was unlocked. He melted snow, tried to dry out, and warmed up his frozen hands. Inside, it was a luxurious 8 degrees Celsius or 46 Fahrenheit, which was much better than what was outside. Now it was September 14th, and Don had been paddling for 40 days since leaving Coppermine. It was still pretty cold in that trailer, though, and he stayed put, rested, and tried not to panic. And that's when he found a sealed carton of chocolate milk, which had expired a decade ago, but he tried it anyways and said it was darn tasty. He said it was the best drink that he'd ever had. But outside, the freeze-up was coming fast, and now he was 11 days behind schedule. The ocean around here typically begins freezing the first week of October, and Don was running out of time and options. His sons were probably panicking now. He was just 2 days away from Tuck, but he couldn't go anywhere. He had to ride out another storm. And he had limited options. Should he wait to be rescued, paddle as far as he could when the storm breaks, and then walk the final 50 kilometers or 30 miles to Tuck, or wait for the ocean to freeze solid enough to walk across the whole way? Now, what would you do in this scenario? Because there is no version of me paddling away from that warm shelter with expired chocolate milk and random supplies in the middle of the Arctic alone in late September. But Don didn't have enough food to wait for freeze up. So he thought about leaving, but without guaranteed shelter, the risk was pretty high. He said, without this protection, I just don't know what would have happened to me these last few days. It would have been very serious. After 5 days of howling wind, sub-zero temperatures, and frozen water rations, the Arctic finally gave him a break. The wind and seas calmed, and Don decided to go for it. He shoved his kayak into the sea and paddled out like a man possessed. McKinley Bay had been a prison, almost his grave, but now he felt like he was back in the game. He hoped the worst was over, but it wasn't. Not even close. Shorelines were starting to freeze and slush was building in every direction. Don had barely escaped McKinley Bay, but now again he was stuck on a low exposed sandbar again, trapped between the rising sea and the coming freeze. He spent days unable to move. One good storm from the north, he thought, and that would be the end of me. His sandbar would vanish and that'd be it. He couldn't even take his clothes off to sleep anymore. They would just freeze solid, so he curled up in his frozen gear every night. He was dehydrated, hallucinating, he wasn't eating and barely drinking anything. And then he awoke in ankle-deep water. The sandbar was flooding. He jumped up and shouted to himself, "If you don't get out now, you'll never get out." After 3 months, 900 kilometers or 1,500 miles and countless disasters, he was almost there. He was able to paddle slowly, and then the slush crept in. It crept in slowly, slowed him down a little bit, but then it came in faster, and then eventually the ice sealed him in. He couldn't move, he couldn't paddle. He was just sitting there upright in his kayak. He couldn't reach his food or water in the kayak hatches, because there was ice around him, but it wasn't frozen enough to stand on. He tried to climb out of the kayak, but fell through the ice up to his armpits again. And then he would crawl back to the kayak and drag himself in it. And then he would try it over and over, standing on the ice, would fall through, would come back on the kayak, and then he did it again and again for hours, hoping that the ice would be thicker each time. And then right in the middle of all that chaos, as he was sitting in his kayak just staring off into space, something grabbed his attention. It wasn't a polar bear this time, but just a few feet away, an Arctic fox lunged out of nowhere and killed a bird right in front of him. Feathers exploded everywhere and blood was on the snow, and then the fox vanished with the bird in its mouth. Don just sat there, freezing to death in a kayak, watching death happen around him. By nightfall, his entire kayak was entombed in ice. His hands were shriveled white claws, he had no protection from the wind and cold, and he was freezing to death. And in his mind, he saw a final image of himself. He said, "I saw a clear picture of myself sitting upright in my kayak, all white and covered in frost, frozen, head resting on my chest. I was frozen in time. What a photo it would make." You have to laugh at him finding this dark humor in that moment. But somehow, that tough old bugger survived the freezing night, which honestly defies logic. He did say later that he was lucky. If the wind was stronger or it was a little bit colder, he wouldn't have made it. And the next morning, to his surprise, the ice was frozen around him and solid enough to walk on. So he slowly got out of his kayak and cautiously stood. For once, he didn't fall through. He kicked at the kayak to get it loose from the ice and dragged it to shore, and he said, "I looked back at the grave-like hole in the ice, the shape of my kayak. I was leaving my burial vault behind." He got to shore and pitched his mangled tent and made some soup. He then chugged a half-frozen can of Pepsi that he had and said it was one of the best things, probably better than the expired chocolate milk that he ever had. He said it was cold, sweet, and there was a new strength that surged through his body. It was his first drink in 4 days. And then, just when he thought he was all alone, he heard a noise. It was a plane, not a hallucination, but a real plane, and it was flying low. Don waved a garbage bag and screamed his frostbitten lungs out and gave it everything he had, but then they kept flying. He was sure they had seen him. Hadn't they? They must have seen him. There's nothing else out here. He was sure they hadn't seen him because they just flew by so fast and didn't even slow down or turn around. But they had seen him. And what caught their attention was that dark kayak hole in the middle of the ice where he was frozen in place. That stood out to them and they could see it easily from the sky. And rescue was coming, but he just didn't know it yet. A while later, the plane came back, and this time it passed directly over Don multiple times, and he knew what that meant, that a helicopter was on its way. And so, like any logical man freezing to death in the Arctic on the brink of starvation and dehydration, he made chocolate pudding. Because after everything, ice, hallucinations, slush, claw, frozen hands, 5 days trapped on a sinking sandbar, he wasn't leaving without his pudding. He'd earned it. And then came the roar of the helicopter, rattling the air and flattening what was left of his camp. And what was Don's reaction when the helicopter returned? He wrote it in his journal. He said, "I feel thankful but sad and not happy. I was mixing my hot chocolate pudding powder in my hot water, really upset that they were here so soon. I was still hungry and determined to have my hard-earned chocolate treat." Oh, Don. He actually refused to leave his tent at first, but then he realized, wait, what if they leave without me? He stepped outside of his tent to meet the rescuers, and they took one look at him and were shocked. They said, "You are not in good shape." Don did not agree with them. He said, "I'm fine, I'm just a bit cold." Meanwhile, his hands were literal frozen claws at his side. He tried to explain that he planned to rest a couple of days and then he would just walk the rest of the way. And they told him, "No, that's not happening. Get in the helicopter." So he listened to them. Don was lifted off the ice and there was no celebration, no fist pumping or heroic soundtrack, just a half-frozen man with pudding in his beard staring silently out the window as the Arctic shrank below him. His journey was over. As Don was airlifted to safety, he looked down at what would have been his final stretch to tuck if he had chosen to walk, and the ocean below was already freezing solid. The land was a tangled mess of rivers and bogs, and there was no real way through. He realized that he would have never been able to walk that. But that didn't bring relief. Don couldn't shake the feeling of failure. He soaked in a hot bath for 3 hours as his limbs thawed into a burning, aching pain. His hands and feet were frostbitten. He might lose fingers, and he might lose toes. His son Dana arrived and told him that he'd been the one to call and get the search going when Don missed his return date, and that decision saved Don's life. And the wildest part of the story is that the rescue team almost missed him. From the air, they did spot that dark shape frozen into the sea, which they thought was his kayak, and next to it they saw all this blood everywhere from that bird that was killed. The rescue team thought they were looking at a scene where Don was attacked by a polar bear. Later, they told him that just a few hundred yards from his tent, 7 tundra wolves had been prowling, and he hadn't seen a single wolf all summer, but they knew that he was there that night. Back home in Winnipeg, surgeons amputated the top 2 joints of all of his fingers on his left hand, part of his thumb, and several toes. But he gained something new. He said, "I always thought that my self-esteem came from my past accomplishments, but the loss of my fingers and toes made me realize what I can do today, not what I've done, is what matters. And any problems that I have now are only as big as I let them be." And Don finally admitted the truth to himself, to his son, that his condition had been worse than he had ever let on, and that he was done. The tent would never be pitched again. His adventure days were over. He became emotional and showed some humanity when he talked about those last days and said, "I was just another human with many frailties." It was the closest he ever came to breaking. And for all the chaos, the ego, the obsession, this moment showed that Don Starkle wasn't perfect, but stubborn enough to survive what would have killed almost anyone else. After everything Victoria had endured in the Arctic, most people would have gone home, shut the door, and sworn off kayaks for life. But Victoria wasn't most people. She wanted to finish off the trip from Tuck to Joe Haven to complete the full Northwest Passage. She didn't go back to prove something to Don or even to finish what they started. She went back because something about the North changed her, and she couldn't let it go. And this time there was no one else driving the trip, no deadlines, no one obsessed. No yelling at her from the kayak while rage paddling. This was her expedition, and she was going to do it her way. Originally, Victoria planned to buy a truck and drive the Dempster Highway to Inuvik with her kayak in tow. But then she had a costly house repair and couldn't afford a new truck. So plan B was to paddle the entire Mackenzie River and keep going to the Arctic Ocean. The Mackenzie River is a beast. It's North America's second longest river, stretching over 1,600 kilometers or 1,000 miles. It carves its way through forests, mountains, swamps, and delta before spilling into the Arctic Ocean. Victoria launched from the town of Fort Providence and took a deep breath and headed north. The first night she camped solo for the first time on a major expedition. Just her and a set of fresh bear tracks in the mud. She kept noisemakers and a shotgun close by, hoping that she'd never have to use them. And she thought of Scottish explorer Alexander Mackenzie, who paddled this river in 1789, hoping it would lead to the Pacific Ocean, but instead he reached the Arctic Ocean. And of course, Indigenous people have lived along this river for thousands of years, navigating it long before Mackenzie's discovery. What made her trip unforgettable weren't the rapids or the views, it was the people. At one cabin, a family invited her to stay and learn how they hunted. She couldn't stay that long, but they gave her moose meat for her journey, and she sat with them for a couple hours and didn't want to leave. In one village, a man handed her the shirt off his back when she said she needed one to cover her arms. She nearly cried. In Fort Simpson, she restocked supplies, and another man told her, "Paddling the Mackenzie is like hitting your fingers with a hammer. It feels real good when you stop." That's kind of like a lot of these adventures. And she met all kinds of travelers along the way. A group headed to Great Bear Lake, another aiming for Alaska. An old man lent her some tools to fix her paddle, and a woman warned her about rapids coming up and told her where to look for a black wolf along the river. And sure enough, right where she said he was going to be, there was this huge black wolf trotting alongside Victoria on the shore. They locked eyes in a moment that Victoria would never forget. She reached the sprawling Mackenzie Delta, watched the sky fill with birds, and toasted the mighty river for carrying her this far. And on July 9th, 1 month after she started, she reached Tuck. The Mackenzie had been the warm-up, and now the real journey was about to begin. It was also in Tuck that she met Phil and Mark, 2 men preparing to kayak the Northwest Passage in a custom-built 23-foot tandem kayak. Their original goal had been to get to Cambridge Bay, but now they decided to shorten the route and end in Coppermine, which was the exact route that Victoria was going to take. They had a marine radio, an emergency beacon, and all the gadgets Victoria didn't have, so teaming up with them kind of made sense. But then came a moment that stopped her cold. While sorting gear near a helicopter pad, she looked up just in time to see a chopper descending, which was nothing unusual, but then she saw what was dangling beneath it. And that was a kayak. She recognized it. It was Dawn's kayak. It had just been recovered, and the image of it swinging through the air, all beaten and ghost-like, it really hit her hard. She was about to paddle in those same waters, and she knew what happened to Dawn. She had no illusions about how dangerous it could be. And you may be wondering what the locals thought about this plan of these Southerners. Well, if you recall, many told Dawn and the group that they were crazy, even suicidal, for attempting it. And their opinions had not changed. They thought Victoria, Phil, and Mark were just as nuts. It was whale hunting season, not a great time to be heading into polar bear territory. Local hunters were concerned for their safety and helped Victoria mark her maps with safe camp spots and known bear zones. 9 days later, the trio was ready to leave. Victoria had a gut feeling that she might have made a mistake. Phil was a nice guy. He was pretty calm and easygoing, but Mark was not. He was full of ego and kind of annoying. He told her point blank that she may not be able to keep up with them because, after all, they were kayak instructors. Victoria had just paddled over 1,000 solo miles in a month. She paddled the Arctic Ocean twice with Dawn, which alone should qualify her for some kind of award. Apparently that didn't count. And then they quizzed her on her gear. They said, do you have a dry suit, a sea anchor, spray skirt with a rubber gasket, satellite radio? And she said no to everything. She was getting a bit worried. Was she really that unprepared, or was she just being underestimated? Either way, she wasn't going to let that stop her. On July 19th, they were all getting ready. And Mark and Phil were suiting up like they were preparing to walk on the moon. They had full dry suits, neoprene gaskets, spray skirts, life jackets, the whole deal, which actually is not a bad idea. They were super prepared and safe and had the best gear. But Victoria was used to paddling with Dawn, and they had well-worn gear. You know, he was wearing his Amazon lightweight jacket. She just wasn't used to it. Phil and Mark also had every gadget imaginable: solar panels, a 12-volt battery, stereo system, camcorder, shotgun, tripod, and even a pressure cooker. It was a lot. Just 2 hours in, Mark was complaining about a sore wrist, so they pulled ashore. They'd covered only about 6 miles, and Victoria was annoyed. She'd been aiming for at least 30, and suddenly she was the Dawn Starkle of the group. The next day, they reached the same stretch of coastline where Dawn had been rescued, and it felt kind of surreal. But there really wasn't time to reflect. A pod of belugas surfaced below them and was diving alongside their kayaks, and Mark wanted to film them, and he suggested that they raft the kayaks together so he could stand on top and record them. Victoria was playing along until she noticed the wind suddenly shifted to the northwest, and they'd been told by the locals, if that happens, get off the water immediately. So her instincts kicked in hard, and she said that we need to get off the water now. Mark was a little bit annoyed with her because he didn't get his filming in, but they reluctantly followed her, and they were safe. The next day, they reached Atkinson Point, another spot Dawn had nearly died before. You'll be hearing this a lot. This place where Dawn almost died, and that place where Dawn almost died. But this was one of them. And it was that evening that Mark told them that they were staying put because his wrist wasn't improving at all. And Victoria was okay with that. She said, okay, I'll be leaving on the tide in the morning, no problem. 2 years ago, she'd been the rookie and the one trying to keep up, and now she was the one making the calls and knew exactly when to walk away. Less than a week after leaving Tug, Victoria parted ways with both of them, and she felt nothing but relief. Finally, it was just her on the water. She paddled across McKinley Bay, energized by the solitude and the quiet, and just going at her own pace. Her trip was nothing like Dawn's through this area. His was chaotic. Seals were popping up all around her. It was like another episode of National Geographic. Days later, while she was collecting snowmelt for drinking water at her camp, she found fresh polar bear tracks heading straight towards her camp. She sprinted back there with her heart pounding, and there was no bear, luckily, but just tracks fading into the sea. She had the shotgun close by that night. I mean, how brave is she just to keep going with polar bears roaming around every corner? When Victoria arrived at Cape Parry, the home of the party shack, she was greeted by that whole welcoming committee that Dawn saw. Word traveled fast that someone was kayaking out there for fun. People were baffled. They just couldn't believe that people were doing this. And then somebody mentioned Dawn's name, and they said, oh yeah, we remember him. He was half frozen, half delirious, and we found him shivering in the party shack the year before. Victoria mentioned that they paddled together, and they said, oh, you're the one he was talking about. You don't have to be nice about him. He wasn't to you. Victoria just cracked up, and she was surprised that he mentioned her at all. She spent the next day hanging out with everybody and enjoying the warm bed and laundry and hot food. As she left, someone handed her a care package of fresh fruit and bread, which made her weep, because in the Arctic, that's basically treasure. A little over 2 weeks later, in early August, she landed in Polituck and got hit with wild news that Mark and Phil had been attacked by a bear on that same beach that Victoria had camped on. They'd been cooking inside their tent vestibule, a move even Dawn Starkle would have probably frowned on. but a bear ripped through the tent and slashed Phil in the shoulder and grabbed him by the ankle, trying to drag him out. Mark managed to fire a shotgun through the roof of the tent and scared it off. And luckily they were near the dew line station, so help wasn't too far away, and they were okay. Victoria was a little bit shaken, but not too shocked. She said, "This is the Arctic, and this is always part of the risk. This woman has the composure of a glacier. She's just so chill. Bear attack, no problem. Beans for dinner, fine. Just keep paddling." In Pawlatuck, when the surf pounded for days, the fog wouldn't lift and the winds wouldn't stop, so Victoria accepted what her Inuit friends had been telling her all along. Gently, though. They were very nice. They said it was time to stop. The weather was just too bad. So her trip was done that year. She wouldn't finish it that year. She was a bit bummed when she got home to Winnipeg at the end of August and thought, "Nope, I'm not done. I'm going to finish that trip." So in 1994, Victoria was planning the grand finale to her 3-year Arctic saga. This time she would solo paddle the 1,600 kilometers or 1,000 miles from Pawlatuck to Joe Haven and finish that full Northwest Passage by kayak. Before she left, she spent every spare moment working on her memoir because she gave herself only a 50-50 shot at survival. She said if she didn't make it, she wanted her kids to know her full story. Now that's hardcore, and it's even crazier than some of the Mount Everest and K2 stats. When she got to Pawlatuck, the ocean was still frozen solid except for a few narrow leads going out of town. She wasn't about to wait. On June 29, she pushed off into one of those leads into the midnight sun. She had 400 kilometers or 250 miles ahead of her to Coppermine. But by July 1st, she was blocked by pack ice and forced to camp in grizzly country. She pitched her tent near a canvas shelter with a gaping hole that had been torn out of it by a bear. She had her shotgun, her flare gun, air horn, and bear spray close by. And it was good because that night she woke with a strange feeling, that strange feeling she felt before, and she knew what it was. It was a bear. It was a massive grizzly outside her tent, walking along the shore, digging up ground squirrel burrows. And then it suddenly caught her scent. Victoria froze and the bear started tracking her footprints, swinging its head side to side and focused on her tent. It started coming straight for her. Her heart raced and she loaded the flare gun frantically, tried it and the first flare misfired. The second one she aimed between him and the tent, hoping to drive him off, and it exploded with a bang right in front of the bear. He paused but didn't really flinch. And that's when she realized that these bears are used to these big bangs. The sea ice is cracking and thundering all day long. So it wasn't out of the ordinary. Victoria whispered, "Please don't make me shoot you." She tried a third flare, which exploded right at his feet, and this time it freaked him out and he ran away. Lucky. Beyond Cape Young, the shoreline was choked with shifting pack ice. And this was yet another place where Don had nearly died in 1992 when he gambled on those shortcuts across those big bays. But Victoria chose a different approach. She avoided the shortcuts and played the long game, carefully paddling between ice floes and dragging her kayak across the ice whenever she needed to, but never gambling on a narrow lead. And then the wind shifted again, this constantly shifting darn Arctic wind. It slammed back into shore and she was trapped. For 2.5 days she waited. Eventually she just said screw it, and she started walking her kayak, hopping from ice floe to ice floe, using her paddle to push ice away. Her legs nearly gave out and her paddle took a beating, but finally she was getting close. Don had passed this same stretch and called it one of the most desolate places he'd ever seen, and she felt it too. But she gave herself a pep talk saying, just 6 days of good paddling is all you have left. You've got this. On July 18th, Victoria paddled into Coppermine, soaked and exhausted. And the locals knew her by now, so they came over, and one of them asked her about a rumor they heard, that she had brought hair dye with her and that she used it along the way. And she laughed and said, "Of course, the 24-hour sun bleaches my hair into a copper color, and I don't want that, so I dye it." Which is hilarious. And somewhere out there, Mark and Phil were probably clutching their gear checklists in disbelief and wondering how she made it this far with no sea anchor, no dry suit, and her flawless roots. By mid-August, summer turned pretty savage. Winter was coming and Victoria was almost there. But then, surprise, surprise, another storm hit. Rain and then sleet and now snow. For 2.5 days, she stayed huddled in her tent and listened to the wind howl. When skies cleared, she pushed forward, and she could now see Joe Haven in the distance. There was white caps on the water and 3 brutal miles ahead of her. And then she was forced back to shore. She could practically taste the McCain deep and delicious chocolate cake she had promised herself when she got there. Just one more paddle day left. She could have walked that final distance, but she hadn't come this far to walk. She fought the current, the winds, and exhaustion. The salt in the water stung her lips, and her arms begged for mercy. And finally, at 2 p.m., she paddled into Joe Haven, grinning and soaked to the skin, and dreaming of that cake. As she paddled towards shore, her memories hit her. 2 years earlier, her and Dawn had limped into Joe Haven from Spence Bay, gaunt, sick, and not speaking. She was furious then and done, but now she was back, alone, steady, and stronger than ever. Not someone's paddling partner, not a supporting character. This time she returned on her own terms. And as she approached town, she spotted the familiar landscape. Emotion flooded in. What began as a warm-up paddle down the Mackenzie River had become one of the most remarkable solo Arctic expeditions ever completed by a woman. Victoria Jason had become the first woman to kayak through the Northwest Passage. Dawn once said the Arctic had a way of revealing who people really were, and Victoria's journey revealed about her that she was never just following someone else's path, she was carving her own. Victoria didn't stop after 1994. She returned to the Arctic again and again, not just to paddle, but to give back to the communities. In 1996, Kabluna in the Yellow Kayak won the Manitoba Book of the Year award and became a national bestseller. But her proudest achievements happened far from the spotlight. She had fallen in love with the people of the North, their history, the culture, and the coastline, which she now knew by heart. She helped bring kayaks to the community of Pelly Bay and worked with locals to train guides, and in 1998 the hamlet launched its first ever guided kayak tour, which is led by the Inuit, paddling in their ancestral waters once again. Victoria spent the next few years giving talks, meeting fans, and inspiring a new generation, especially women, to embrace the wild. She passed away in 2000 at the age of 55 after a battle with cancer. But her story didn't end there. Her 3 daughters paddled part of Victoria's final route, and they visited the places that she loved most and reunited with Indigo, the steady snowmobile guide who transported them across the tundra. The same man who helped carry her forward was now witnessing her daughters bringing her home. They spread her ashes at her favorite river and waterfall. They built an inukshuk in one of her old tent rings facing into the Arctic wind that she had always loved on her face. And in those places, in the salt air, in the sea spray, where the children are learning to paddle once again, Victoria Jason's story continues. Don survived his own Arctic hell, minus the few fingers and toes, and he published Paddles to the Arctic. For all his obsession, the journey actually gave him peace. He said, "I don't have to prove anything to myself anymore. Finally, at age 60, I'm at peace with myself. My adventures are done." And then, of course, he kept paddling. He actually paddled 22 kilometers a day on rivers around Winnipeg. That was kind of retirement Don style. In 2010, a devastating house fire left him badly burned and brought his paddling days to an end. 2 years later, in 2012, Don Starkle, who had fought off pirates, frostbite, starvation, storms, and taunted polar bears and walrus, lost a final battle to cancer. He was 79. Over the years, Don was honored many times. He was inducted into the Manitoba Sports Hall of Fame, received the City of Winnipeg Community Service Award, and was honored with the Manitoba Order of the Buffalo Hunt. And that's kind of like you did something badass or meaningful for the province. Congrats, you're now a buffalo hunter in spirit, which is kind of cool. Though Victoria and Don never paddled together again, not a big shocker, their names are forever linked as 2 stubborn, passionate souls drawn to the ragged edge of a map. And both of them made history. So thanks for watching this epic 2-parter about obsession, survival, and expired chocolate milk. If you want to support the chaos in these videos, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and become a member. It really helps keep these forgotten stories alive. I really love researching these and sharing them with people. So we'll see you next time.